So we are in chapters 9 and 10, and we're really needing to bring this to a conclusion this evening, which means there's a ton of ground to cover. So Hebrews, the letter to the Hebrews, chapters 9 and 10. And we did a lot of the stuff, the background stuff that the author of this letter assumes that you know. And if you are a Jew in the first century, almost 2,000 years ago, you know this stuff. If you're an American in the 21st century, some of the stuff you may not know as well because it's not part of our culture. It's not our cultural context. We have to fill in some of these gaps. And so when he makes these references to, say, Leviticus, and what's he talking about from Leviticus that we talked about last week? Leviticus chapter 16. Anybody remember what Leviticus 16 is? Okay, all right. So when the priest goes into the most holy place, what is that? What do we call that? That is the... All right, that's the Day of Atonement. So the most holy day in the calendar, it's the day that the priest enters in. So the question is, why does the priest enter into that place? What's the priest doing? What does he take with him? All right, he takes blood, and what does he do with that blood? All right, he takes the blood and he sprinkles it on all the pieces of the tabernacle, comes in here, and then sprinkles the blood on the ark, the mercy seat itself, which is what resides on top of the Ark of the Covenant. So that's where we ended last week, was kind of talking about that. And I raised the question, and I said, is it okay? I mean, who's allowed to go into the most holy place? Is that the way I phrased the question? Something like that? I don't remember what question. Oh, well, but that's not the gotcha question. The gotcha question is, who's allowed to go into the most holy of holies? To which the normal answer is, well, yeah, the high priest goes in, once a year. He's allowed to go in. To which I say, I'm not sure that's the best way to think about it, that he's allowed to go in, as the case is, the way that we think of that word, usage of that word. And this is where I left off, where I was wanting to start. Think of it this way. What is the blood doing again? The blood being sprinkled. What's it doing again? All right, purifying or cleansing. All right, he's going into this room to clean, basically. Clean this room. How many of y'all have stayed at a hotel before? Okay, a couple of you. All right. How many of y'all have stayed overnight or multiple days at a hotel? Yeah, when you depart and you have all your stuff all over the place, normally you rip the bed sheets off, right, and you hang them in the bathroom or do stuff like, I'm not the only one, right? No, I've never done that. Please don't think that I have. No, anyway, whatever you've done to that room, when you get back that evening, what's happened? It's nice again. It looks just like it did when you walked in for the first time, right? They might have even put another little chocolate on top of your pillow, depending on how nice the hotel is that you're staying at. So that's the job of somebody to come in, clean this room, and then what? And then get out. Have you ever walked into the room and had a guy, the cleaning guy or whatever, he's sitting in the chair, he's like, dude, this is an awesome game. They're down there in the last minute. Why don't you come on over, grab one of those sodas from the fridge right there, and let's watch the end of this game together. That ever happen to anybody? No. That has happened? Oh, well, it's not supposed to happen. when you walk into your hotel room, yeah, why is that not supposed to happen? Why would you feel weird if you walked in and the cleaning person was sitting in a chair watching the game? Because that's not their place, right? That's your space. They're not allowed to just come in willy-nilly into your space. And when they come into your space, which is, it's yours for this time, they only come in to do what they're supposed to do, and then what? And then get out. You don't sit down unless what? Unless you're invited. Unless it's your space. When you walk in, you can toss your coat on the bed, sit down in the chair, kick your feet up, and watch the rest of the game, right? Because it's your place. You belong there. The cleaning person does not belong. They're not allowed to just go into any room that they want to go into whenever they want to go in there and do whatever they want to do. They have one specific job where they enter into the room, they get it cleaned, and they get out. So the question then becomes, are they allowed to just go into your room? Well, no. That's not the best way to think of it. They have to complete the job that they have to complete, and then they get out. That's the way that it works. That's what's happening right here. The high priest walks in and into a place that, typically speaking, it is forbidden. He is not supposed to be in there, but he has to go in to complete his job one time out of the year, get in, sprinkle the blood, and then get right back out again. That is what he has to do. So that's what the Hebrews author is making a comparison right now between Aaron and Jesus, and the Aaronic priesthood compared to the Melchizedekian priesthood, and how they are different. So keep that in the back of your mind as we're talking about the Day of Atonement. So now he doesn't just reference Leviticus chapter 16. Last week we also talked about Numbers chapter 19. What's in Numbers chapter 19? Anybody remember? That's the rules for when you've come into contact with what? Okay, when you've come into contact with something that's dead, you are unclean until you've gone through these specific rules that are set in Numbers chapter 19, which involve the killing of a heifer, a red heifer, and then you have it's burned in a certain way. You have the ashes that are then mixed with water, all of that. And then that gets sprinkled on you with hyssop, scarlet wool hyssop that he references, and that becomes a purification. The sprinkling of that which has been killed, the sacrifice, the blood really of the sacrifice, that gets sprinkled for cleansing. And then he also talks about, we didn't really talk about this much, Exodus chapter 24. Who remembers what's in Exodus 24? I'm going to lean on the kids just a little bit here, because I think they know this. All right, Sean just said it's the covenant for the Israelites. In Exodus chapter 24, that's where Israel becomes a nation. And they did so by promising that they would obey all the decrees of the covenant, all that the Lord has said we will do, will be obedient, right? And then they took some bulls. They killed the bulls, and they took the blood, and they sprinkled half the blood on the people, and then they sprinkled half the blood on the altar. Why did they do that? Has it been a while since y'all have looked at Exodus 24, maybe? It could be. I'll lean on the kids again. Why did he do that? What did the blood do? All right, it sealed the covenant. Julia's not one of the kids, but that's okay. Yeah, it sealed the covenant. It was the way that they signed the contract was with blood. They sprinkled it on the people, and therefore they became connected to the contract, the covenant, and then they sprinkled it on the altar. Why the altar? All right, because it was representative of God. God wasn't there in some kind of corporeal way that he could do it himself and have it sprinkled on him. Therefore, the altar stands, it's like a power of attorney type of situation. They use the altar to represent God, and both parties become connected through blood, binding to this covenant with one another. So the blood is what cleanses, and the blood is what connects and enters into a covenant. It purifies, it cleanses, and it brings into a covenant. Therefore, he says, you could almost say, and obviously he's using good preacher talk. Remember, I think Hebrews is a sermon. He doesn't go so far as to say anything absolute, but in chapter 9, verse 22, it's like you could almost say that under the law, everything's purified with blood. Without the shedding of blood, there's no forgiveness. Therefore, verse 23, and I want you to think hard about these verses right here. Therefore, it was necessary for the copies of the heavenly things to be purified with these rites or these rituals. What rituals? What's he talking about? Okay, first of all, let's parse this. What are the copies of the heavenly things? This right here, right? He established that in the beginning of chapter 9. The tabernacle on earth is a copy of the heavenly. And this had to be purified with the blood of what? Bulls and goats, right? That's the phrase that you see throughout Hebrews. So the blood of bulls and goats was good enough to purify this. However, the real thing, he says, must what? It says the heavenly things themselves with better sacrifices than these. In other words, the heavenly things, let's make sure that we're following what he's saying here. If the copy has to be purified with the blood of bulls and goats, it's necessary for the heavenly things to what? Be purified with something better. Now, what does that then mean about heaven? Okay, it's kind of like this, right? It's the main. But what is the Hebrews author saying? That heaven itself needs to be what? That heaven itself requires purification. And that's an important facet for us to make sure we're understanding, because, if I would have started the class, maybe the Hebrews class, by saying, how many of you all think that heaven is a place that needs to be purified? Show of hands. Would anybody raise their hand? We don't think of it that way, right? But the Hebrews author does. He says that we needed to purify this with blood of bulls and goats, and that's good enough. But this needs to be purified as well, and the blood of bulls and goats ain't going to cut it. You need something more to purify heaven itself. Therefore, what? Christ. A better sacrifice with better blood purifies heaven. So why in the world does heaven need to be purified? All right, Kelly just said, I don't know. That's fair.
Does it really need to be purified? I mean, for what he's trying to convey to them about the blood of Christ, then maybe that's the connection to give them information that they can understand. I don't know that.
But that's his argument.
I guess I'm with Kelly. I'm trying to figure it out.
Yeah, but that's his argument. If this needs to be purified with the lesser, then the heavenly, that phrase needs to be purified, he's letting it slide over, and he's using it twice. It's said once, but he's using it twice grammatically. The heavenly needs to be purified with better. So yeah, he's saying it does require purification. Heaven needs to be purified.
Well, is it because without Jesus' blood, there is no way for sinful man across all of history to enter into heaven? I mean, even from, the patriarchs, Jesus' blood goes back and cleanses even them.
Mm-hmm.
So it goes both ways. So without that, there's nothing to cleanse the people who God wants to have with them in heaven. There's nothing that makes people righteous, no matter what point in time that they live.
Okay. All right. So, and that which is, and that may go to also what Cliff was saying. Is it heaven under discussion, or is it a purification of the people? And I mean, if I'm understanding what you're saying, that it is purifying, reaching back and purifying everybody up to this point, as well as purifying everyone forward, which absolutely is the case. At the same time, though, he is saying that just as the pieces here had to be sprinkled with blood to be purified, blood had to be sprinkled in some kind of way to purify, to cleanse heaven itself. Kelly?
You told us a couple weeks ago or last week that the reason, or you led us down the trail of the reason why the altar had to be purified was because it was among sinful people. But I'm still trying to wrap my head around that one because Jesus is the only one that got to go back. Are you trying to? Or do you think are you saying the Hebrews author is trying to infer that Jesus took sinfulness on his aura back when he went? Or I don't know.
Okay, and I'm glad you brought that up, because that's part of the crux of this entire argument, is what happens on the Day of Atonement. And remember, why did this need to be cleansed? Because why? It was on earth. But nobody sinful went in here, right? Nobody actually did anything sinful in here. So why would it need to be cleansed? How can the stuff out here affect this? All right, Sean said it's tainted by proximity. Bruce? Was that a hand up, Bruce? Yeah. Okay.
Well, Christ, when he died, confronted sin and the devil and could have been considered unclean at that point. So if he then raises from the dead and ascends into heaven, he could have been considered unclean. I don't know, I'm just supposing. And then if he went to heaven, heaven would be unclean with him.
Yeah.
So I don't know.
The principle's the exact same. Think of it this way. When God created what is created, he attached himself to it. Heaven becomes intricately attached to all of God's creation. He walked in the garden in Genesis. He was there with them. There is a connection. And then what does that creation do? That creation sins and taints everything that's connected to it. Everything that has anything to do with creation is tainted due to sin. It's the hearts of the people, but it doesn't just stop right there, because if that was the case, then all you'd have on the Day of Atonement are these two goats, and then you have one that's sacrificed, and then you put your hands on the other one and send the sin outside the camp, and you're done with it. But that's not all that happens on the Day of Atonement. This happens on the Day of Atonement. The cleansing of the pieces of the tabernacle, which, by the way, all of these pieces point back to what? The Garden of Eden, going back to Genesis chapter 2. And so it's in Genesis chapter 2, the pre-fall state, That's where everything was perfect. God looked at it and said, behold, it was very good. And then sin takes place, and more sin, and death takes place, and more death and murder. And you get to Genesis chapter 6, and it says that the thought of humanity was just evil continually. And God saw, you have that phrase again, and God saw his creation, and God saw, and behold, it was corrupt. There's a big difference between very good then and then now corrupt. Everything attached to it. Remember how I told you people, probably in my high school thought that I smoked? You remember that story? I didn't smoke, but they probably thought I did because I was in close proximity to smokers for a good 15, 20 minutes every morning inside the cab of a pickup truck. Well, heaven is in close proximity to a sinful creation. Cliff?
I'm trying to still understand this, but I can understand the atonement, and the sacrifices for men because of the sin that has come into the world. And because of the sin, we need to have some kind of atonement or forgiveness. Forgiveness is what we get from Jesus in his sacrifice. I can't understand why heaven would have to be cleansed even by the blood of Christ, because that would indicate that there's something corrupt or sinful in heaven if it mimics what's on earth, which, it's just a shadow, but still, there's sin on earth, and that has to be atoned for.
And I think maybe part of the issue is that we come from a very Western concept of sin and atonement, which is very personal. It's me, it's I, and it's what I've done, and my sinfulness, and it's all about that. Whereas there's a bigger picture about what humanity's sinfulness has done that affects not just me and my life and my things, it affects heaven itself. That the sinful taint of everything that humanity has done is so awful that it taints anything that's even remotely connected to it, like a haze of sin that falls on it. And heaven itself is affected by the sinfulness of man, to where what God is doing when he is restoring everything to the way that it's supposed to be, it's not just saying, you know what, Chris, I'm going to cleanse you of your sinfulness so that you can be here for eternity. It's saying, I'm going to undo the effects of sinfulness on all creation, and not just creation, but wherever I have been in heaven itself that's tainted by the fact that the perfect creation became imperfect. That has affected heaven and God itself. We need to see sin for just how awful, unholy, horrible, drastic it is, and just how much it affects more than our limited scope. It affects God himself. He doesn't sin. I'm not saying that sin has taken place in heaven, right? You understand? I'm not saying that anything sinful has happened in heaven. What I am saying, though, is that when God created this existence, he attached it to heaven. Right? There's a firm line in place, right? Where there is God and there is the not God. There's a clear line in place that we might call a what? That which separates man from God? Maybe a veil, right? There is a clear line here, and man cannot go beyond that and get up here. You just can't. But God can cross that and come down. And so all of this has affected up into this. And so when the cleansing of Jesus takes place, he doesn't just cleanse my sins or the sins of each of us who are sitting here. It's not just a matter of cleansing everybody's personal sins. He's cleansing the entirety of what it is that sin has done. And that goes back, as Julia said, all the way back to the beginning. All the people of old, they get cleansed by the blood of Jesus. When David writes, "How happy is the one whose sins are forgiven," his sins are only forgiven by the blood of Jesus Christ. Yeah, he doesn't know it yet, what it is, but that's what's cleansing him. Josie? Because everything, yes, if it has cleansed the effects or corrected the effects of every sin, then why do we still feel the effects of Adam and Eve's sin? Did I get that right? Yeah, because of the way that it is working. All right, it has cleansed heaven, but yet there is still stuff that's taking place down here. Right now, we are in the middle of a now but not yet. Because has it cleansed us? Yes, absolutely. Anybody who has come to the blood of Christ has been cleansed by the blood of Christ. That cleansing, that perfection in that way has taken place. That has happened. And yet, God does not force that upon anybody. And because he is patient, and he doesn't want anyone to miss out. He wants everyone to come to a knowledge of the truth. His long-suffering, his endurance, his patience is going to allow this middle state until such a time as he determines that it's over, so that as many as are willing, desirous, and want to will join in with that perfected state. Does that make sense? Yes, Jan. Okay. Okay. All right, so before your second word, I want to verify because I'll forget. So the first word, Jan said, there are two words that come to mind. The first one's relationship. And that this relationship was broken by sin, and in this, God is restoring relationship. Is that fair to what you said? Okay, now, continue. Sorry. Okay. Yeah, exactly. And she said the second word that comes to mind is the idea of choice. That God, he wants the relationship restored. He's not going to force it. It's there for those who will choose. For those who continue to reject, they have the opportunity. If they want to follow the path that the devil and his angels, Matthew 25:41, right? That hell was created for the devil and his angels. It's their place of punishment for their rebellion, yet anybody who follows after them into that same rebellion will end up in the same place. That's a choice that's made by following after the rebellion or following after God. Joe?
Yeah, I was going to kind of mention what Jan was saying. I was going to ask, would kind of be a good way to look at this be like around the time of Adam and Eve, and before the fall versus after the fall, and how they were in perfect union and relationship with God before the fall, and then after they sinned, God could no longer have that relationship with them, and that's where the Satan kind of entered the picture, and there was that separation, and there's that separation, and But before that, they were in perfect union with God. And
Yeah, one of the things that we're not given enough information to know exactly what that relationship was like pre-fall. We just have so little information. But what we do know is that it's drastically different afterwards. And we have a whole lot more information about what the post-fall relationship is like. We do know before that they were able to be in God's presence, whereas afterwards, right now, John tells us no man can see God. He tells us twice in the gospel and in the letter, in other places, we can't because of, I think, the impurity of sinfulness. So humanity is unable to see God. That's why this veil is put there. That's why the cherubim guards the way, lest they come in, eat of the tree of tree of life, and then live forever in a fallen state that is a horrible existence. Blocking man from the tree of life in Genesis 3 was not a curse. That was actually God's mercy that he was giving on them, or giving to them, to keep them from living forever in a horrible state, a state of sinfulness. So yeah, pre-fall to post-fall, there's a huge change in relationship. And that's so much of what this is. All of creation is there for our relationship with God. And as long as creation is doing what creation is supposed to do, it glorifies God. But the point in which creation ceases to do what creation is supposed to do, God is no longer glorified. Therefore, when we live as God would have us, according to the will of God, God is glorified. When we don't, we take that away. So yeah, definitely a pre-post idea. Jason, was your hand up earlier, or were you just stretching? Okay. All right. Now, we really do need to move forward. You may have some more questions on this, and that's fine. Spend some time, chew on it a little bit, think about it. But we're following the argument that the Hebrews author is giving. And what he's saying is that the blood of bulls and goats was significant enough, it was good enough to cleanse this, but in order to cleanse this, you needed a better blood than what that could offer. Because what you're cleansing now is not just purification rites and things such as that. You're cleansing morality, the problems of morality. And so, let's see here. Verse 24, chapter 9, 24, for Christ has entered not into holy places that are made with hands, the copies of the true things, but into heaven itself, now to appear in the presence of God on our behalf, nor was it to offer himself repeatedly, as the high priest enters the holy places every year with blood not his own. If it was so, he would have had to have suffered repeatedly since the foundation of the world. But he appeared once for all at the end of the ages to put away sin by the sacrifice of himself. And just as, how many times do people die? Once. And then comes judgment. How many times did Christ die? Once. Man only dies once. He didn't die in order to then die again, and then again, and then again, and then again, right? Man only dies once. I mean, that's the argument he's saying. Just as for man, we only die once. Christ's sacrifice only happened once. Because he's the only one, right? Under this system, you could do it year after year after year after year. Why? Because there's lots of bulls and goats. You can have the next crop that's coming up and pick the best one out of it every year. a different one is used, but there's only one sacrifice that could possibly cleanse this, that could possibly cleanse the conscience, our conscience. There's only one sacrifice that'll work. And since man only dies once, how many times was he going to offer the sacrifice? Once. That's the point. By the way, that's what he's getting across in verse 27. He's not trying to tell us, hey, by the way, you guys didn't know this. You only die once and then comes the judgment. He's using it as part of his argument. So Christ, having been offered once to bear the sins of many, will appear a second time to die again? No, because he only dies once, right? He's going to appear again to not to die for sin, but to save the ones eagerly waiting for him. Chapter 10, since the law was just a shadow of the good things to come instead of the true form of realities, it can never, by the same sacrifices continually offered year after year, make perfect the ones drawing near. Otherwise, would they not have ceased to offer them? Since the worshippers, having been once cleansed, would no longer have any consciousness of sins. But in these sacrifices, there's a reminder of sins every year, because it's impossible for the blood of bulls and the goats to take away sins. Now, I don't know if we're going to get through this conversation or not. Hopefully we will. How many of y'all have heard something to the effect of the sacrifices of the old covenant rolled your sins forward? And heard that type of an idea. This is where that comes from. Is that what this is saying? What is he saying about the sacrifices of this system when it comes to your sinfulness? Say that again. All right, the sins never went away. What he's saying is that those sacrifices can have absolutely nothing at all to do with your moral sinfulness before God. They can't roll them forward, they can't push them, they can't satisfy God good enough for now until the real one comes. That's not what they're doing, and that's what the Hebrews author, and by the way, Paul hammers this point home really in Romans a lot. They have nothing at all to do with your moral sinfulness before God. These sacrifices, they don't touch it. They were never meant to touch it. Remember, we had the conversation, all they can do is take you who are a part of Israel, you become impure, so you are outside, and then they can purify you to be part of Israel again. They cannot have anything at all to do with your conscience. Nothing. Zip, zilch, nada. It's not what they were designed to do. But what can they do? What does it say that they do? What's that?
Make perfect those who continually draw near.
Well, it says they can never make perfect, right? But what does it say in verse 3? They are a reminder. They remind you of sinfulness. They don't have anything to do. They don't touch it. They don't heal it. They don't appease God enough to last another year until it can happen again, until Jesus comes. They have nothing at all. But they're a constant reminder that you are sinful people, that Israel is a sinful people, that the whole world is a sinful people, and there needs to be an answer for sin. And as they remind you that there needs to be an answer for sin, what are they also reminding? That answer's coming. That if God established this system, which does this for your cultic, cultural purity, if God established this system, then they are a hope looking forward to that God's got a bigger answer for the bigger problem. They are there to remind you of your sinfulness and to point out that something else is coming. Verse 5, consequently, when Christ came into the world, he said, sacrifices and offerings you haven't desired, but a body you've prepared for me. Burnt offerings, sin, You take no pleasure. And I said, behold, I've come to do your will, O God, as it's written in the scroll of the book. Yeah, Anyway, these are, Old Testament quotations that he uses. But let's get to the heart of the matter here, in our final 4 or 5 minutes right here. Verse 11. Every priest stands daily at his service, offering repeatedly the same sacrifice, which what? Can never take away sins. They have nothing to do with sinfulness. But when Christ offered how many times? One time. What did he then do? All right, don't miss this. All the priests, what do? Verse 11, every priest what? Stands daily. Why does he stand daily? Okay, because he has to offer the sacrifices. Why doesn't he sit down? Because he has to offer the sacrifices. And then he has to offer the sacrifices. And then he has to do it again, and again, and again, and again, and again, and again, ad nauseum, right? He has to offer the sacrifices because his job is not done. And even the high priest, when he goes in here, does he sit down and watch the rest of the game? No, because obviously there's no game there. But even if there was, it's not his place. That's not his job. He's not supposed to go in and sit down. He's supposed to go do his work and get out. So what's different about Jesus? Is he constantly standing? Yeah, he doesn't sit. He walks in to this place right up here. Not even this one. He walks into this place right up here and he sits down because the job is done. And that's where he belongs. That's his place. He's not just a cleaner who comes in, does the job, and get out. This is the Son of God himself who has finished the work that he is going to do as far as the shedding of his blood for the forgiveness of sins, the cleansing and everything associated with it. He finishes the work and he goes in and he sits down. That is one of the most important aspects that you're supposed to see from the comparison between Aaron and Jesus. Aaron constantly stood. The Aaronic priesthoods constantly stood. The high priest constantly was standing. Jesus offers himself and sits down because he's not like them. He is better than. His blood is better, it cleanses better, and he finishes his work, and then he sits down because, verse 14, by a single offering he perfected for all time those who are being sanctified. As Julia said earlier, this sacrifice, one time, it goes all the way back to the very beginning, and it's going to reach all the way forward to the very end of those who require the cleansing blood of Jesus. Verse 15, the Holy Spirit also bears witness, saying, "This is the covenant I will make with them after those days, declares the Lord. I will put my laws on their hearts and write them on their minds." And then he adds, "I will remember their sins and their lawless deeds no more." Have we seen this before? This sounds familiar from like 3-4 weeks ago. Sounds familiar, right? What's this from? All right, this is Jeremiah 31. That is the ending of chapter 8. And then he brings it up again right here. This is an inclusio, right? The bookends idea. He has the forgiveness of sins there, the difference between the old and the new covenants. He has it right here. Folks, this is where his argument is coming to its head, right here. Verse 18, "Therefore, where there is forgiveness of sins, you don't have to give an offering for it anymore." He's done. He's finished. He's done his job. And he sits at the right hand of the throne of God. because that's his place to be. Now, next week, we're still just a little bit behind, but it's not bad. I think we're going to be able to catch up just a little bit here. But we're going to start in verse 19. Verses really 19 through 22 is one of the most, in my opinion, one of the most important sections of the entire Bible. This really encapsulates, in fact, when I study with people, this is what I build to in my studies. Starts in Genesis, and it builds to this passage right here. That's how fundamental and important this one, I think, is. All right, very good, guys. Thanks a lot. We are over by about a minute, but that's all right. We'll do okay. Sorry, I didn't give you all a chance for extra questions. If you guys have any questions, come ask and talk to me. And if they're too tough, I'll ignore them, but otherwise, hopefully, I can answer them all right. Thanks, guys.